From the National Museum of African American Music in Nashville, Tennessee, this is Just Conversations, presented by the Metro Human Relations Commission.
Welcome to this episode of Just Conversations. Today, we are speaking on the topic of equity and the LGBT community in Nashville. I'm your host, or moderator, Brian Marshall, and I am joined here today by my wonderful panelists who are going to have a wonderful conversation about these issues. Just a little background about myself. I am the founder of a nonprofit organization called Mashup Nashville, which actually addresses health equity issues for Black and trans LGBTQ individuals, and also have the pleasure of serving as a senior program manager in the Office of Health Equity at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. So now I'm gonna give the stage over to my panelists and allow them to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Brian. My name is David Wyley Long, and I'm a senior national organizer with the Black AIDS Institute based in Los Angeles, California. Additionally, I serve as a community health ambassador for Meharry Medical College.
Thanks, David. I'm Vic Sorrell, and I am a gay Nashvilleian for more than 20 years, a life coach, training consultant, and also a member of the board of Nashville Pride.
Thank you, Vic. And I am Jarissa Greenard. I am the community educator for the Vanderbilt HIV vaccine program.
Thank you. We have an esteemed panelist up here with us. So fortunately, I know you all, so we have these conversations all the time. So let's just get right into it. Jarissa, can I start with you? I just want to ask, and this question is for everyone, what issues around equity would you say are very prevalent right now in the Nashville community?
I would say right now, in terms of health equity, HIV can have a severe impact on our community. And so that's where my expertise comes in, where I'm collaborating with just researchers and community members, and one day hopes of developing an HIV vaccine.
Yes. Awesome work. Vic, I'm gonna go to you to tell us what issues are you seeing that are impacting the LGBT community here in Nashville as it relates to equity?
Well, one thing that I think is really important to consider is equity is so much more than presence. Presence is important and representation is important, but power is so pivotal with regard to who has power, with regard to making decisions. And so I think in that way, what we're finding in our community is that it's becoming more and more important that we have more people who are Black and brown in positions that are making decisions. Not just board members, not just community members, although I think that is important, but I think we need to have decision makers who represent communities that are not white. And I think that that's something that's growing. I'm so happy to say that Nashville Pride just recently elected its first Black president, Mac Huffington. And I think that we're going to see more of that. I hope we see more of that. I think it's very important.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that. David.
Both of you bring up two important things that just plague our community as a whole. One thing that I continue to see, and we all see driving these streets, is homelessness. Homelessness compounds the efforts of social workers daily, because just think, that is the foundation of everything. You wake up in a safe space, you're going to have a great day. But if you're waking up under a street overpass, or not know when your next meal is going to be, or where is there a good opportunity to shower, that is going to compound any efforts to secure a job, to secure medication. So we see all these new homes, and they're building them everywhere in Nashville. If there's a plot of land, there's a new home building up. But what are they doing for these youths that don't have anywhere to go? As a servant for the past 9 years in Nashville, I've seen just an influx of reduced services, or their services just isolated during the winter months. But if I need a home 365 days of the year. And I just see that lack of equity and lack of just robust inclusion within different populations that are not even talked about. Just recently, I literally had to pull over when I saw they tore down the rescue mission on Rosa Parks. It's gone. Where are those individuals that were sleeping there, that were safe, that were dealing with the many social ills that plague Nashvilleians? Where are they going? Are they all going to the mission on Lafayette? Are they all going to, individual places where it's not safe? So I think to have a really balanced conversation, we have to get to the fundamental root of what plagues us. And that is homelessness. And until we solve that, we really can't begin to help them, because just think, that is something that I'm privileged to have. I know after a long day or stressful day, I have somewhere to go, and I can get a safe place to sleep, and I don't have to worry about those issues that make my day hard.
Yeah, when I listen to you all talk, it sounds like really where the conversation is going, and what we need to address are the social determinants of health. So Jarissa, you work in the Vanderbilt vaccine trials, and we know there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy, but that comes from some historic activities that brings about that hesitancy. We talk about power and how the power dynamics. We have a lot of conversations about people who are in power, who make the decisions, and how that impacts someone's health or just their overall well-being. And then we talk about homeless. We've been working. I've known David since 2013, and we started a project together that everybody's all aware of, where we've been dealing with these same issues for not just even this year, but for many years. And so I do want to, have a positive aspect of this conversation. What are some things that are happening in the Nashville city that is actually working?
One thing that I saw that I noticed while working at Fisk University, I had the privilege to attend a police cadet training that brought police cadets into communities that were unique and different. Cultural communities. They went to the Muslim community. They visited a mosque. They went to the Hispanic community of Nashville Pike. They went into the LGBT population. They went into these unique populations that the academy couldn't teach, but they learned from firsthand frontline workers of what ails that individual community. How can that community be better? I think that was groundbreaking, because it really zeroed in on a collaboration approach, opposed to just coming into the community. But how can we collaboratively work together to not necessarily end issues, but work to find better solutions? Because there's always going to be certain issues that just plague communities. And not to be a pessimist, but just looking at realistically what we're dealing with. So they came in, and that was something that has been impactful. They've continued to do it. I've continued to see progress and what have you. And those small little relationships are really impactful towards the long term of a policeman coming into a situation, into a city that they may not be knowledgeable about. But now they have 5 different populations they can go into and say, oh, I've seen you before, I've talked to you before. And they may handle a situation differently. As we know, police brutality and the different defund the police, those are front page news, but that's a game changer in how we view the police and having that collaborative relationship to strengthen communities as a whole.
Collaboration. I like that. That. You spoke, Vic, briefly, and I want to make sure that we reiterate this point. Here in Nashville, we had a historic election of the first Black woman, first Black LGBT, first Black lesbian. I'm elected as president of the board of Nashville Pride. But is that enough? What other things have you seen that you can say has been a success in our city?
So number one, no, that's not enough. And a lot of times, we were talking about this before the conversation we're in now, is that establishing equity or creating equity can a lot of times feel inequitable, because all of a sudden, if you're so used to the pendulum being over here and a normalcy of inequity, then when you start to create more balance, it can sort of feel like we got too many Black and brown people talking. All of a sudden, everything's all about Black and brown people, right? It can feel like that for some people. But that's a very important part of creating equity. So absolutely, we need more Black and brown people in positions of authority that are making decisions. And something else that I think, to speak to your point, I was driving the other day and I saw a billboard in Nashville, Tennessee for PrEP, HIV prevention medication. And 10 years ago, when PrEP first, in 2012, when it first came available on the market, 1 pill once a day to prevent HIV if you are not living with HIV. And to see that billboard 10 years later in our city, that is important work, so that people know there are resources that they can access to protect their health and to empower their decision-making around their healthcare. So,
and I just want to put a pin here and say that these people who are sitting on the stage with me have played a role in some of the things that you see that has been advancing the LGBTQ cause here in our city. Jarissa, has there been enough done in our city as far as putting people in the right positions? You know, I will say that I was so proud a few years ago when you and Keith were appointed, along with Vic, were appointed along at the VUMC rather, to lead the Vanderbilt vaccine trials unit. I joined the Vanderbilt vaccine trial units because I saw someone that looked like myself represented in that space and wanted to learn about, you know, vaccine trials and how they worked, and to help me relieve some of my hesitancy. But are we doing enough? Do we have enough people who are representative, not just of the LGBTQ community, but also people of color in places where they can make decisions so we can see some change?
Right. And I think the answer to that, to your question, Brian, is no. I think a lot more can be done. Representation is so important. And so when you see yourself in positions of leadership around you, that in turn also empowers you to want to immerse yourself in that discussion or opportunities. And in this case, it's around HIV vaccine research. And a big part of our research is really a collaborative event between community members and researchers. And one of the tools that we use to operate that is our community advisory board, a board that reviews our protocols and our consent forms to ensure that the research that we're doing right here in Nashville is benefiting not just some communities and not discriminating against other communities, but including everyone, because the idea is that once a vaccine is one day developed, we want to ensure that that vaccine works effectively for all communities and that no one's excluded from that table. And in order to do that, we have to continue to set up a table and to invite people every day and really meet people where they are. I think a lot of the times that sometimes research can be a little bit intimidating, and one way that researchers can help overcome that barrier and meet communities is really providing simple vernacular, simple conversations to really break down how vaccines work, to how do I get into a study, or how is everything monitored? How can I feel safe in the work that we're supposed to be collaborating together and it not be one-sided? You want to have this consistent dialogue that's over.
I love that. I love that. So let's kind of shift just a moment, and it's still staying in the breath of, you know, addressing equity and the things that are working, the things that are not working. And without, you know, we don't have to name any specific organizations or call anybody out. But and you know, we have these conversations all the time. You know, I think it's great that we're here, but we've been having conversations like this for the past 10 years. How do we move from having just conversations? Y'all like how I did that plug? How do we move from just having just conversations to actually putting some action into practice? And I'm gonna give this over to Vic.
A couple of things come to mind. The first is, and this is very much my current work, so I think that's why it was top of mind, is learning how to interpret policy within an organization and mission of an organization to determine whether that policy is racist or anti-racist, inclusive or not inclusive, with regard to LGBT, with regard to multi-ethnic communities, et cetera. Ibram Kendi talks about how important it is that our policy reflect what our values are. And unless it's written into our policies, then we're not committed to it. If it's not written down, we're not serious about it. And I think that that's probably one of the most important things we can do as far as action, is start to become hyper aware of our policy and what it's really saying.
Yeah, David, you've done a lot of work in advocacy. You know, you were part of the Black Tennessee AIDS Network, which does a lot of advocacy work and moving something from just a conversation to change. What are some strategies that you've seen, just in your experience, that have worked, that we can actually incorporate into a practice?
So you bring up something that is impactful. We are making progress, you know, that billboard, you know, continuing the conversation, because sometimes if we're not talking at all, that right there is a problem in itself. So just addressing the elephant in the room, talking about it openly and honestly. The Black Treatment Advocacy Network that you talk about and all of you are a part of through Black AIDS Institute is using real-time statistics, but also other cities as a metric, as a rubric to use. I think one of the things that it's not that it may not happen, but it may have to look different from what we were trying to do, and that's sexual education. Metro Nashville public schools just continues to not have this label where they cannot talk about sexual education. That is a problem. That is something that they have to learn at Boys and Girls Club. That's something where they have to learn on Facebook. And we know once you learn something off the internet, it comes convoluted and what have you, because it's so much out there. So really just dialing it back and what are we trying to achieve? And if the ultimate goal is inclusion, equity, and what have you, what does that look like? How do we know? Because I think one of the things that we're constantly looking at is how do we know we have progress? Mm-hmm. We know systematically there are certain things and, systematic barriers. I'll take racism, for instance. That is a key barometer of where we have been and where at present day. I was joking earlier and saying that back in the day, we never thought we would have a Black president. That was something that we just didn't think was possible. Bill Clinton technically was our Black president. And here we've had two, just to see that progress and that continue to shift. And that is the rubric that we are now. Young boys and girls can now believe that they can be president. So there has been, steps in to show the progress of what we have done. I think it's also important that if we're not going to get comprehensive sexual education in schools, is making sure those community centers, making sure those Boys and Girls Club, making sure the parks, making other entities that don't have the stranglehold, if you will, provide those necessary resources. And community-based organizations are those lifeblood, are those latchkeys that can teach and preach the importance of learning about that, and just make that as the progress, because we continue to fight something that may not be not necessarily worth fighting, but if we're getting one desired result, we may have to look somewhere else to get that same desired result in a different form.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to shift just a little bit, because we've been talking a lot about representation, and as I look on this stage, I don't see a representative of the trans community, and oftentimes, we leave out our trans women in these conversations. Oftentimes, they're not invited to the table, and if they are invited to the table, maybe it's a hard time, identifying a trans woman to be a part of these conversations. Jarissa, how can we do a better job connecting with the trans community here in our city to help bring them to the table so their voices can be heard?
I think a lot of what you're asking here is how can we build relationship? And I think that's the most important part, that we forget that there's a human aspect to that. And so really trying to identify what are those gaps, what are those needs, and going back to what David was saying earlier about talking about those social determinants of health. If I can't cover my housing, if I have economic setbacks, the last thing I'm going to think about is engaging in a conversation. So how can we utilize our resources and our relationships to try to fill those gaps for that community? And I think that's the question that we need to ask ourselves, and so that we can start holding ourselves accountable and making sure that we are doing the work that we need to do.
Yeah, and just to make sure I clarify, I'm speaking, when I say trans, I'm talking about trans men and trans women, that
and
we
gender
want to,
non-binary,
and gender
yes.
non-binary. We make sure, because they are also a part of our community. We want to make sure that everyone is included in this conversation. David, you have worked with our trans community. What are some of the issues some of the barriers that you've seen to getting the trans community a part of the conversation?
I think the trans were, I never want to speak. Mm-hmm. I remember eloquently in 2015, the great Lasaya Wade told me, don't speak for me. Mm-hmm. And it was a life lesson that I took at heart, because although I was servicing a unique population, I had to realize that they're not monolithic and that they are very broad strokes, and these individuals are completely different. And although they may do the same thing, they may hang out at the same park, you may have 10 different individuals and what have you. So I think one of the things to get them to the table not necessarily as a challenge to me, because we know that there is seeing how they propelled to get their voice out there, because we can give them the opportunity. That's never been the concern, but making sure that we're hearing them and not looking at them or not taking receiving what they're saying, because that is something that they continue to say. You're not listening to what I'm saying. I'm here, I'm present, but you're not taking in every single thing that I am. There has been a lot of inroads with the trans population that I have seen. Just recently, a proud trans lady just opened up a new club on Murfreesboro Pike. And I was just so happy, just the jubilation that she had and all of that. Those smaller steps, and that is being part of the community. That's equal of being a panelist to her, because she just wants to be acknowledged and heard as anyone should be and what have you. So I think those small little steps, how can you make more progress with the trans community? Listening and just having them know that you hear them, because that is most of the time what they truly deserve and need to be heard.
Yes, thank you for that. Vic, I want to bring it back to you. You spoke briefly about organizations becoming anti-racist. And I think that we can all agree, or maybe I just speak for myself, since like you said, Lasai said, don't speak for me. So I'm just speak for myself, that we know how racism has had a huge impact on the lives of, people's health and their well-being. How do we, and please help us understand, as our beautiful white man representative here, how do we break these barriers of racism in order to really have the conversations about how we get to the root of where the change needs to start?
There are, I think, many answers to that. One thing that I think is true is the realization that racism significantly affects access to services, to experiences, to opportunities, resources. I think that's what I said first.
That means you need to reiterate resources.
Because
resources.
it's important.
Period.
Exactly.
Period.
Resources is a very important part of it. Yeah. And I think that realizing that not everybody feels safe in all spaces, and rightfully so. And I think Jarissa made a great point a minute ago when she said, we aim to meet people where they are. I agree with that 100%. And I remember a few years back, I was in a room where someone said, you can only meet people as far as you have been. So I think the work then becomes every day on an individual basis. Where can I go that I haven't been? What can I read that I haven't read? How can I become familiar with somebody's experience that does not look like me, that has not grown up where I grew up or walked a similar road as the road that I've walked, so that I can be aware of what they might be feeling. I think that's one of the first ways that we can start to create equity, is just being aware of the difference of experience of humanity.
Yeah. David and Jarissa, I have a lot of conversations, just being a part of our Office of Health Equity and addressing health equity issues on a regular basis, that I do see how the roots of racism are the causes for many different issues that we talk about and have been talking about for the past 5-10 years, and issues that haven't gone on longer than that. How do you all see racism being a barrier, and what are some strategies as Black individuals, a part of the LGBTQ community? How do we address it?
I think Vic had a very great point on how you can get access to resources. And I think one of the tools that we can use to combat racism is definitely education. And there are so many different platforms, so many different books, speakers, authors who are dedicated to this topic that we talk about. And there's so much hurt and pain around that. And I love how Vic was saying that what can I do to make myself more aware of someone else's experience? Because in learning about that, you also generate this sense of empathy. And then from that, we hope that people are so moved by that emotion that in turn ignites them to move and take action. So how the question really is, how can we ignite people? And I think the step towards that is education. So what can I do to pick up? What can I do to learn? What I can do to play a role in this much bigger space? Because something that we talked about earlier is sometimes there may be this misconception that you have to make this really grand and big gesture, and really it just can start with the smallest of acts. And it only takes you trying to implement that day in and day out and being consistent about that will you start to be anti-racist.
Yeah. David, you are from New York, Jersey area, and you moved to Nashville. Do you see a difference in how racism has impacted the lives of the LGBT community there than it does here?
New York is definitely not Nashville, but the people are the same. And I think in order to constantly move forward, is one word comes to mind: being courageous. Being courageous. These are hard conversations. Very, very. I applaud Vic for just have the courage to speak openly and honestly from his vantage point. You know, we are brothers in our life. We come from different walks of life, but walking hand in hand and having those tough conversations. And sometimes you want to ask something, but you're scared, what have you. But those courageous conversations continues to help in racism and all the isms, because a lot of times people just don't know. So having more courageous conversations can help, because we're all the same. We're all human, you know, no matter how we identify sexually, geographically, class, all that, you know. But just recognizing that once we start pranking the intersectionalities and the layers that compound the relationships and having those courageous talks, we can get to a better place, and we are getting there.
You know, I'm from Nashville, born and raised, playground where I spend most of my days, you feel me? And, you know, I've seen a lot of change here in Nashville. You know, we can have a whole nother, if we had 30 more minutes, we would talk about how, you know, how the communities are looking different, how people are being moved from different communities, and how that also impact health and access. But, you know, we are sitting here in the National Museum of African American Music in downtown Nashville, where people associate with only country music. And this beautiful Ephesus, this beautiful building is so inspiring that I really want to leave this conversation just on a good note, with a final thought of the possibilities, because somebody may not have thought this building was possible for the building we're sitting in right now. So if you can leave with just a quick sentence, providing a strategy or a final thought rather, on how you see us moving forward.
I leave with meet someone new.
I like it. Meet someone new. Vic.
I think it's go where you haven't been.
Meet someone new. Go where you haven't been. You got the last one. Let's go. Come on.
Action is the antidote.
Say that one more. Say it louder for the people in the back.
Action is the antidote.
Action is the antidote. And on that note, I would like to thank all of my panelists for being here. You all are so wonderful and great. I'm so glad I know you, and you all can cash at me, you know, after this is over, you know, for making y'all look so great. I'm just playing. But I also want to just thank you all for tuning in to Just Conversations on the topic of equity and the LGBT community here in Nashville. Again, my name is Brian Marshall, and see you next time.